I welcome Sharyl Attkisson back to the podcast. She was on a little bit ago, and man, do we have an incredible conversation to have today. She just released a new book called Follow the Science. And before we get into it, for those that are not aware, I can't imagine there's many that aren't aware of who you are, but there are some young people, my children included, who may not fully know your full career. So let me read an intro here before we get started. Sharyl Attkisson has been a working investigative journalist for more than 35 years and is host and managing editor of the nonpartisan Sunday morning TV program Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson. She has covered controversies under the administrations of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. I think we can throw Biden in there, emerging with a reputation, as the Washington Post puts it, as a persistent voice of news media skepticism about the government story. She is the recipient of 5 Emmy Awards and an Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative reporting. She's a New York Times bestseller and has worked at CBS News, PBS, and CNN, and is a 6th degree black belt master in Taekwondo, which is probably necessary for the line of work that you do.
Oh man, you got the one with a typo. I don't know where that came from. I am 5th degree master, and someone elevated me to 6th. And that should be correct. I'm sorry if I sent you the wrong one, but hey.
Well, we made the update.
So I say potato.
Yeah, I mean, either way, you'd kick my ass. So however many degrees you want to take it. Well, Sharyl, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, this book is an incredible document of so much controversy, fraud. It's hard for me to even know where to begin to start asking you about it, because there's just so much data, and you're really only in Big Pharma. And as we both know, this probably bleeds out beyond the pharmaceutical industry. But what I found so interesting was it read sort of like a thriller, because you start the book where you talk about being a very pro believer in vaccine. It's kind of a staunch, at least by the sound of it, it sounded like when the smallpox vaccine came out, you wanted to get your daughter vaccinated right away. This is back in the early 2000s. And it really takes us on a journey from that to an informed skeptic. And so I'd love for you to share with my audience that journey and how you went from really believing in the medical industry to having some skepticism and just the wealth of information that you've discovered in your reporting.
Well, I came to learn the truth about government after thinking as a young journalist, the government literally, I thought, was not allowed to lie to you. So that was quite an awakening over the years. But I think really until the early 2000s, I still held out the belief, because I never thought about it too much, that the medical establishment was there to keep you healthy or make you healthy, that your doctors told the truth and knew the most, that scientific studies were the gold standard of, what mattered the most, and that public health agencies had your best interest at heart. But when CBS assigned me to cover a series of stories, one of the early ones involving medical issues, being the restart of the smallpox vaccine program, the failed restart after adverse events came up, after the 9/11 time period when we worried that someone could use the smallpox as a bioweapon, my eyes began to open. I call it down the rabbit hole. I didn't know so much of what I learned about adverse events, biologically, how this stuff works, the things the government tried to do to cover things up, things that the military did to try to cover up adverse events among soldiers getting vaccinated. And pretty soon I started saying to some of my sources in government, boy, if occasionally the battery of vaccines in boot camp can knock out or even kill a big burly 18-year-old football player, what might it do to a little baby? Mm-hmm. I'd never asked the question because it always just was brushed off as crazy talk. And I remember someone saying to me, a government source, "You're not getting me to touch that third rail." And I had to look up what that meant, third rail. But it was true that no one wanted to talk about it. And that, of course, piqued my interest even more and sent me down on this journey where I learned so much over the last 2 decades about medical fraud and controversy, which is not unlike government corruption that I had been covering, the same elements with whistleblowers and financial interests. What I wanted people to understand with the book was how I came to the place where I am today. I'm glad you said informed skeptic. I think that's an accurate description, but I started out as a big believer. And I think a lot of people used to, or maybe still do, place our healthcare folks and that whole entity in this special category where they think it doesn't need to be questioned or shouldn't be questioned. And I want them to see with specific data and anecdotes that I've selected how I came to be where I am today as an informed skeptic.
Yeah, gosh, there's so many examples in the book. Why don't we start in the beginning of the book where you talk about one of the earlier chapters. You talked about the frog professor. I thought that was fascinating, and really, to me, that's a good example because it crosses so many different touch points of how we got to where we're at. Meaning, from a medical scientist to big pharma, their relationships, how these studies get made, how the professors get educated in the first place, and then ultimately, obviously, its impact on us, the people who are not, we're the patients, we're the sick and needing the support. So, share that story if you would, because that was fascinating.
The Frog Professor is one of my favorite chapters about a Berkeley professor who, over 20 years ago, was hired by a chemical company to study a chemical that is pretty much pretty much all of our drinking water. It's used on crops. The company knew that the EPA was going to be examining the use of this chemical and hoped that it would prove safe once this researcher scrutinized it. And instead, unfortunately for them, the researcher found many problems with it, primarily initially that it feminized frogs, meaning boy frogs became girl frogs. They developed, ovaries instead of testes, or sometimes they had both. And this led to the company not wanting him to publish and talk about the findings. I'm not sure people understand how carefully controlled research is today. When something bad is found with a medicine or chemical, you're unlikely to hear the truth about it because they won't let the researchers publish that anymore, which makes the scientific landscape corrupted, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But to his credit, he quits the chemical company because he thinks it's important to tell the story. He does independent research that confirms the same, as have dozens and dozens of studies over the years since. And worse, it causes many other things in different kinds of animals and so on. But I think the real story is not just about how we don't get this information, but how companies then use these tactics to smear and controversialize and destroy the researchers who are simply following the science in the truest sense like we used to do. They, according to him, and some of this information was revealed through documents exposed in court, followed him, intimidated him, called his bosses, researched him, bought search terms whereby if you looked up his name, Tyrone Hayes, on the web because you heard about his research, he would look like a controversial quack. And their research that they funded that found different things, meaning the company, would show up instead. A lot of tricks that they typically use, but they were exposed in a really good way with documentation in the case of the frog professor. The little, maybe you're thinking of, were you surprised about, I think I left it for the end of the chapter, but how I asked him about transgender trends?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a
So,
big one.
the obvious question to me, he's done 20 years of these studies on the gender effects on animals of this chemical. And I said to him, I asked him whether he thought this chemical, because pretty much we're all exposed to it, may be playing a role in what I see as these transgender trends where, boys feel like girls and girls say they feel like boys. And he said yes. And he said something I thought that was really provocative. He said not only could this chemical be playing a role, but he reminded me that there are thousands of chemicals we're exposed to, most of them far less well studied, that we have no idea what they're doing, and yet it's in our food, it's in our water, the government allows it. And I thought, boy, that's the answer to a lot of questions, I think. We are constantly being steered, in my view, through propaganda to normalize or not ask questions about our health issues in order that we not look at what could be causing them. And if you look at who's steering us to normalize these things, it's really the same people that are pushing or working for these industries that could be implicated in causing the problems. It starts to kind of make sense. You want to normalize obesity, like this is not a problem, this is all good. Well, look at who's pushing, if you keep following the money, who's pushing this narrative. A lot of times it has to do with the companies that are making products that are probably causing metabolic disorders, that are making people gain weight and have certain physical characteristics and become unhealthy. hey, if you normalize it and accept it and say it's all good, and anybody who questions it is phobic or problematic, then you'll probably never investigate the root cause to try to solve the problem. I think that's sort of at the heart of the book. Why we're spending more money than ever on insurance and pills and doctors and medicine, and growing sicker and sicker with these chronic diseases that our doctors either don't notice or pretend not to notice. And there are reasons for that.
What do you say to the person who feels like that's just too overwhelming, that that's too big of a coincidence? It is everybody involved in this. I remember hearing that when I started to draw some similar conclusions. Um, the notion is that somehow is everybody colluding in this gigantic fraud to, deceive and whatever. How do you respond to that?
When I talk about people in real life, not the book, but just, conversations, they are not ready to receive the information. And I try to remind myself, it's taken me 25 years to receive the information I've received through in-depth research. I
Mm.
didn't believe it either. I was stunned that some of the stuff that I was told was not true was true, because I believe the opposite. So I get it that it's a lot to lay on people when they've had one belief system for so long. And I try not to say too much at one time, because then they just kind of disregard all of it. I hope and think the book does a good job with these anecdotes of taking people piece by piece in a way that they find credible and understandable. But I would say that it's not as though everybody's involved in a massive fraud. It's that key entities have colluded to have sway and influence in most corners of our information landscape in ways that are often invisible to us, and in ways that convince us of something. And we're not part of the fraud or the collusion, but they're so good at the propaganda they've developed and the messages they send and how they control the information that everybody becomes a party to it, even if not intentionally. They're furthering these myths. They're saying something's disinformation when it's not. That's because the big machine is telling them that. It's not because they're part of the fraud individually. With doctors, I go in depth, I think more so than I've seen done, about the medical establishment role, along with politicians and media and big pharma. Doctors, I don't think individually necessarily, yes, they take bribes and kickbacks and they're part of the fraud. Most of them, I think, as I explain in the book, have been steered carefully, starting in medical school, by pharmaceutical influences who write the textbook or reference book that they refer to, who teach the continuing medical education courses without disclosing to them in an overt way that they're being paid by a drug company. They're there as a spokesman for a medicine, but they tell you their academic affiliations and their professional affiliations, and doctors have the sense they're getting independent information about a medicine. So the system is designed by key players. It's set up so that fraud is being committed on us, but I wouldn't say that everybody is wittingly part of the fraud.
Hmm. You bring up a good point in the book where you say, to sort of highlight the propaganda, how, you would do a story. I forget exactly what the story is about, but it had to do with the automotive industry and tires. And you said, I didn't get this backlash of people saying I was anti-tires or anti-cars. And that was such a good point. It really highlighted like just how much we've all been brainwashed and indoctrinated to feel that asking honest, genuine questions is somehow anti something. As we stated in the beginning of the call, you were a believer in the vaccine, for even for your own children, and yet just starting to ask those questions because things weren't adding up started to highlight the backlash that we get is so pervasive, and it does show us, just how brainwashed people are. When you think of like birth control, we all just accept that birth control does affect women's hormones. It affects how you view men and those relationships. Why would we not ask that same question when it comes to these other endocrine disruptors and how that might change how we feel about ourselves or what we're attracted to, et cetera? I think that's a very legitimate question. Um,
Well,
I'm curious.
let me make a little, I didn't write about this in the book. I've written about it in the past. A big eye opener to me was I covered a drug at CBS News called Risperdal that was being given off label to children. It's supposed to be for psychotic children, but they're giving it to tons of kids who just had ADD. And it was causing the boys and some girls to grow breasts. I mean, age 5, boys age
Wow.
5 that had large breasts. interrupting obviously what was normal. And some of these poor boys were having mastectomies in order
Mm,
to, get rid of the problem, even when off the
amazing.
medicine. And then clearly, I remember one of the moms telling me that her son not only grew breasts, but felt different. And this is way before all the transgender stuff. I'm talking 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And she said that he never felt that way, but once he started growing breasts on this medicine, he came out wearing one of her bras one day and said, he felt like a girl. And she said, even after they took him off the medicine, she said he never went back to normal. Like he
Mm.
always had that issue. I started thinking about it, and the condition is called gynecomastia. And now the warning has been added to the label of Risperdal. The drug company was denying at the time. It's not the only medicine that has that potential side effect. And if it has that physical effect, what is it doing that you don't see? That there's not something physical growing on the outside, but it's changing brains. And then I thought, if a medicine can do that, how many medicines and chemicals and what combination of exposures could be causing things like that? And I think that was very eye-opening.
Um, was there any part of you as you were doing that research that is there another future book in your future where you look into the food industry? Because so much of this seems
Yeah,
to overlap.
yes. I mean, it's the same thing, food
Yeah.
slash chemical industry. And I'm reporting for Full Measure, my TV show, on quite a few of these things coming up. I've started researching the raw milk controversy, the artificial dye controversy I've been thinking about for years. We're doing a story on fluoride. All the things that I remember hearing back when I was a young journalist that fluoride in water was bad for you. And I just, without having any information, scoffed and thought, yes, that's crazy. Agreed with whoever was saying it was crazy. No, there's something to it. Fluoride can be very harmful. And there is a big lobby trying to keep it in our water while many people are trying to get it out of the water. So there's truth behind a lot of these things that they've tried to convince us are myths and you shouldn't talk about it. You're a crazy tinfoil hat if you do. Turns out there's a lot of fact-based evidence behind some of these discussions and theories. And yeah, I think there is much more to be said about this. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, bringing some of this to light. I think he's spot on when he talks about the corruption in the establishment. That, as I said in the book, the government, instead of making healthier and better lifestyles and food available to us, forces us, in essence, through its policies, to eat a food that's adulterated with chemicals and things that we know are neurotoxins and carcinogens and all kinds of things you shouldn't be ingesting or giving to your kids. But try to get food without, it's almost impossible because they have been so captured by the industries that want to be sure they're selling their products and that you're
Hmm.
eating this kind of food.
In reading the book, at what point do you draw a conclusion that this goes beyond power and profits and has a darker, sinister intention? That might be a tough question to ask an evidence-based investigative reporter, but is there a personal response that you have to that?
Well, I leave that to other people. I have not found hard evidence, but I've certainly asked the question as to why some of these interests are funding and doing the things they're doing, because it's not always purely a financial motive. There
Right.
are there are interests that are funding wild stuff in the realm of politics and medicine who don't stand to benefit, let's say, George Soros. He's very old and very rich, and the things that his foundation, the controversial things that he's funding, I can't see that he benefits from other than a feeling he has that he wants to do these things, because it's not like he's going to in 10 years sail off with a ton of money and live some kind of life. He's very, very old. He's got all the money he wants. So what is his motivation? I don't know. I've never been able to figure it out. I don't have any evidence of what that is. I enjoy hearing other people kind of try to pick at that, but I don't have an answer.
Well, if you will humor me, I'm going to pick at it because I did have, and you don't have to respond to this, but I had another guest on my podcast who has a spiritual background, a biblical background, and she talks about genetic warfare and how these things tend to, all of these different things that we see as potential problems do have one thing in common. It disrupts reproduction. It disrupts genetics. And it's the one lens that I've been able to look at all of this through and go, that eerily kind of lines up. Tucker Carlson has been a little bit more forthright in his opinions on some of this stuff lately, and he's, identified that it all seems to be anti-human, whether you're aborting, transgender, gay, lesbian, none of these have reproductive qualities to them. And then, of course, all the chemicals, the possible depopulation component of this. It's obviously very frightening, but also very, to your point earlier, it's very, very hard to wrap your mind around that, let alone find, smoking gun evidence to pinpoint it. But I'll leave that for, unless you want to add anything to that, I'll leave
No,
that for.
it's fascinating. I don't have anything to add. I think there's clearly something besides pure money going on in
Yeah.
some. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you hope people take away from reading this book?
As they say, information is power. And I think we feel largely not in control of our own health. I talk to a new person every day who's seeking functional medicine doctors or root cause doctors, or people who aren't doctors but are treating illnesses in ways that doctors are turning their nose up at. There are people, we're all seeking ways to become healthier in the face of our own doctors seemingly not caring about what's making us sick and wanting to either say we're not sick or throw pills at us. You're not sick, you have anxiety, here's a pill. Or because they don't see through the test they want to conduct what's wrong with you, so it's in your head, or it's something take this pill for that. I want people to understand information and knowledge is power, and that they can reclaim control of their health by knowing what they're talking about, by doing some critical thinking exercises that I talk about that helps them identify, not super easy, but it becomes easier, helps them identify better sources, so that when narratives are being thrown at them and even their own doctors are saying things to them that may or may not be true, that they have a way, a barometer where they can measure some of these things against and get better information. And then there are some things that you can do today. I try to end the book with ways that you can contribute to taking back control of your health by looking at information sources, by reporting medicine adverse events of you and your family members because your doctor's not doing what he's supposed to do. And that helps a database that from a federal level will help us identify patterns that are occurring of these chronic disorders and illnesses that are in common with certain exposures in some people, that they are detectable and they are avoidable in some cases, but nobody's trying to catch them or do studies about them or measure them. You can contribute to the body of knowledge. I explain how to do that. So I hope the takeaway is for people to not just accept the narratives that are being thrown out at us all the time, and to find smart ways to seek other information that could help make them healthier, and question the dogma, and even question your own doctors, or find the right ones, demand that they open their minds and treat you the way that you should be treated from a medical standpoint, rather than looking at you, as I think I said, sort of like a target number that should be achieved by a medicine. I mean, I think that's how you're kind of seen on paper right now. The results came in, you took this medicine, your numbers here, that's all good, instead of trying to make you healthier, where you
Yeah.
may not need the medicine, or figuring out why you needed the medicine in the first place.
Yeah. What a concept. So much in reading your book, to me, identified this, to me, it's information warfare, because um, in a passive way, I think a lot of people just view some of this stuff as like, oh, the media is a little bit corrupt, or you hear a little bit, maybe a influencer, gets misinformed or whatever. Maybe big tech has their finger on the pulse of some of this stuff. But reading your book has such a visceral, I had like a visceral response to it. It actually, many years ago, I got conned. And if you had asked me, did I believe that there were con artists out there before I got conned? I would have said, well, of course, I know there's cons, but to be face to face with a con artist and to feel the visceral response of, oh, the psychological rug being pulled out from underneath you, that's the feeling that I got when I read your book. There were so much touch points that I wasn't really aware of that is influencing thought and beliefs, that you illuminate with all of this evidence that's verifiable, that really was shocking. I'd love, if you could, this might be a little bit difficult to do, but I'd love to walk through how a young medical student is going through the system today versus when they did back in the day, and how they might be steered, as you mentioned earlier, and or compromised. Can we walk through a scenario where you have a young student, they're getting educated. That book, as you mentioned earlier, and obviously you mentioned in your book, may have very well been written by the big pharma itself, right? So they're already being steered there. In what other ways might they be manipulated, coerced, steered, and in some cases, threatened with the loss of job? That might be helpful for the average listener to realize how many things are influencing their doctors.
I just spoke to some doctors who, people might say, oh, lunch wouldn't buy me out. Well, weirdly enough, it seems to work with the pharmaceutical industry when they simply buy lunch for doctors. But starting in med school, they will bring lunch into med schools to the young students. And it buys a lot of goodwill and a lot of belief for sort of not questioning them and good relationship. And it starts there. I had a friend who went to become a professor. He's a doctor in Washington, D.C., and he got hired to be a top professor at a Midwest med school. And he said, my first goal is to get pharma out of the med school. And after, I think I told the story in the book, after about a year, he called me and said, I can't do it. I said, what happened? He said, I could not even get the med school to agree to stop taking lunches from pharma. He goes, if I can't get them to stop taking lunches, I can't do anything. He said there was such resistance, and it could be that pharma is, helping fund the med school in some way. There's all kinds of relationships. They give grants. They pay for chairs and seats for professors. They worm their way into the system to such a degree that it's everywhere. But I think the best example, the Merck manual that is considered one of the most popular references for med students, is written by the pharmaceutical company Merck, which promises that its editorial arm is kept separate from its pill-making arm, which has had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for bribery, kickbacks, fraud, marketing bad medicine, dangerous drug ads. But they claim that's totally separate from their editorial arm. So I took a look in the Merck manual, which someone referred to me a long time ago as the pediatric Bible. A pediatrician said they learned from this pediatric Bible. So what are they learning? What are they really being taught? And I found that they're not being taught a lot. There are omissions of really important things in there, but the best example, which I include in the book, is total false information in there. Merck's own HPV vaccine, which is very controversial. I explain why in the book, and how the co-inventor that worked for Merck spoke out more or less against the marketing of the drug once it came to market, and many controversies about it. What does Merck manual teach young doctors to be about its HPV vaccine? Pretty much nothing. It literally says in there are no serious adverse events reported, which I knew was false. I've covered this vaccine and its controversies. And you need only look at the label, which Merck wrote, so it knows this is false. Merck wrote the label, which is approved by FDA, that has dozens of serious adverse events that have supposedly been reported, everything from paralysis to death. But you look at the textbook that doctors are learning from, and it says there are no serious adverse events reported. How that can be allowed, I don't know. But then it's no surprise when these doctors go into regular medical practice, they're not asking questions. They don't think, so much of their practice should be, in my view, knowing what I know now, geared toward measuring and categorizing drug adverse events and making sure you watch for them and report them. They almost never ask. If you came with something, my husband has been to the doctor with obvious adverse events from a drug he just started taking that I diagnosed because I had done a story about it, that the doctor didn't seem to see, that was probably killing him in one case, a rhabdomyolysis reaction to a statin medicine. And when I saw him crawling up the stairs with this knee pain after a couple of days, I knew it just struck me, oh my gosh, I did that story. And the doctor had the nerve a year later to put him back on the drug. And he was crawling up the stairs again 2 days later with rhabdomyolysis.
Jeez.
Point being, they're not asking the questions. The system's not encouraging them to do that. And I think there's a reason for it. It's because they're steered, through this pipeline that teaches them to practice medicine a certain way that I don't think is always in our best interest.
Certainly not. And then on top of that, this is what I'm saying. It's just layer after layer. You start to realize how much steering and manipulation and coercion there is in this. One of the other pieces is the is the like sales numbers. If they have a certain number of patients, or if they have a certain number of positive COVID to patients, et cetera, they're getting bonuses for that, which is so, to me, antithetical to the genuine health care. And I know people have heard that before, but I think one of the things that was illuminated in your book too that opened my eyes was how so much of the big pharma as well as the media point to so-called independent experts. Can you share some examples of independent experts, and how they're often paid? Where do they get their funding from, and how that can be a conflict of interest?
Well, I will mention in the broad sense, third parties like the American Cancer Society that actually get donations from the cancer causing industries, in my view, to do interviews that say, you'd be better off getting mammograms and worrying about that than worrying about the small risk of this industry thing. And then, there's a big story in there about how I thought it was so suspicious. The industry kept referring me to the American Cancer Society to say that their products weren't bad. And I finally said to the American Cancer Society, do you get funding from this industry? And they, oh my God, why would you? Yes, but what are you saying? I'm like, I'm just saying, how much? And I have to disclose that in my story. They flipped their lid when I said that. So that's taken place all over, that these nonprofits and third parties are getting money from industry. But in a more direct sense, I noticed early on when I was doing dangerous drug stories for CBS that the industry wouldn't do interviews with me typically, but they always refer me to what they billed as an independent doctor, third-party doctor, like Dr. Paul Offit of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or other names that I didn't know very well. And pretty quickly, I started going, why are these doctors so quick to take a position that this drug that has safety questions couldn't possibly be causing any risks, when that just doesn't make sense to me? Why wouldn't they be wanting to know, as this is being investigated, like err on the side of safety? Why are they trying to bat it down so hard? And I started cross-referencing through searches I learned to do, as well as asking the doctors directly. 100% of the time, they were being paid by the drug company. They were not independent. And medical reporters, I guess, either I'm the only one that was asking or the only one that was reporting what, the answers to the questions when I asked them, because medical reporters were doing the same stories and interviewing the same people and holding them out as if they were independent resources, and they're not. I
Mm-hmm.
think I was the first one to start saying Dr. Paul Offit, who's held out as a vaccine, independent defender, actually invented one of the controversial vaccines he defends. He's the inventor of it, made hundreds of millions of dollars, although he won't disclose how much, works for Merck, sits in a chair that's funded by Merck at Children's Hospital. No one was reporting that until I started saying, doesn't mean he can't have a valid opinion about something, but
Sure.
viewers must know so that they can weight the opinions when these people are being paid by the industry. So I expose and talk about some of that too, like you said in the
Yeah.
book.
Yes. Very powerful information. Let's switch gears a little bit to COVID. Obviously, that's the big pandemic that we've all been experiencing on a global scale. And I want to talk about some of the things, because I still talk to people every day today that still don't understand and or realize some of the shenanigans, if we put it lightly, that occurred. So first and foremost, can you explain where COVID came from, and what the nature of its origin was in terms of whether it's a lab leak or organic?
Well, we knew, according to government experts on the inside who were good sources for me, right away in the pandemic, they had concluded, because they could examine this, genetically and see how it's put together. They knew early on that this was man manipulated, as they put it to me. And we know it came from the Wuhan lab, and we know that we had funded, meaning taxpayers, gain of function research. I still hear people every once in a while go, oh my gosh, there's some evidence maybe we fund. No, we funded gain of function research. That's in studies. The words are in the studies that they published for the government, and I've referred to those in the book, so you can look them up yourselves. I've printed the grant numbers that we've used in part to fund these studies with China. When people are like, oh, did we really fund? Yeah, here's the grant numbers, we did.
And
So
explain what that is real quick for the average listener.
the grants,
No, the gain of function.
gain of function is really risky research that many researchers don't believe should be done at all because it's so risky, where you take something that's not dangerous to people, a virus that can't infect people, it just stays in animals or bats. And you manipulate it so that it is infectious in people. So you use, in this case, humanized mice. It's mice, I guess, that have some genetic components of humans, and you see if you can get the mouse infected. You keep changing and changing the bat coronavirus until it infects the humanized mice. And then you've got something that can get loose in people with the supposed goal of, we want to do this so that we're predicting this could someday be unleashed naturally upon the world, it evolved by itself, and we want to have the vaccine ready. So this is basically vaccine research the government is doing to make $1 billion vaccine. The crazy part is they have to accurately predict among thousands and thousands, if not millions of things that could advance and infect humans, that this is going to be the thing for that vaccine that they're going to invent to actually ever be profitable. But they're doing this research and they're funding it, and they're making something dangerous to people that wasn't dangerous. The risk is it could get out accidentally through some kind of leak or be carried out. It's a pretty high risk. You have to be very careful when you're experimenting with this stuff. So, it was even banned for a time, that type of research in the US, because it was thought that we didn't have proper controls. So here we are doing it in China with the communist Chinese, who we know for every bit of research they do that has a civilian purpose, they always also have a secret military purpose to it. Most researchers, the independent ones I spoke to, said it was fool's folly that we ever would partner with the communist Chinese on sensitive research. They don't understand why we did. But long story short, we knew early on this is where it came from, and that it was a result of research experiments originating here in the United States with partnerships from some people in our academic institutions here, and partnerships with the communist Chinese.
Quick deviation, the communist Chinese bought a spin-off of, I forget the name of the Big Pharma that had created the what's it called, Atrazine chemical that you were referring to early in the conversation, the one that changed manipulated the frog sex, that was bought by a Chinese company, and they're the ones that are essentially spraying our crops, putting I guess it's on sugar and corn. And
yeah, they own the chemical arm that now makes atrazine, which is a Chinese company owns the chemical arm that makes this controversial chemical that we're spraying on everything.
Yeah, so we'll let people decide what they think that means to them. But going back to COVID, with Fauci was very clear. We all know Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was very clear that they did not do gain of function research. I thought it was very interesting, some of the things that you shared about him in your book. I forget exactly what his current or what his then current title was, but you had alluded to that it really should have been more about biodefense, if I'm remembering correctly.
Well, I spoke to Paul Thacker, who has a great Substack, the Disinformation Chronicle, and he used to be a researcher on medical controversies for the Senate. He's done some amazing work, and he brought up the point that Dr. Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, under the National Institutes of Health, that this used to be a bioweapons defense group that's been renamed. And he said, if it still carried its old name and people understood that it's bioweapons research under this umbrella still being conducted, we're not allowed to conduct offensive research because we've signed international agreements that we won't create bioweapons for offensive reasons. Paul Thacker argues we're still doing it, of course, to some degree, and that if people understood and didn't call Dr. Fauci the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, but the head of the Bioresearch Defense Institute, they would understand more fully what could have really been happening with this research and its implications. But instead, he had this title that sounded like it was about allergies and viruses,
And that implication being what?
Well, that it was sort of, he's the good guy. He's just trying to figure out how, diseases shouldn't be spread.
No, I'm sorry. The implication of him being biodefense.
The implication that research we were doing could have completely different implications and purposes than the stated purposes that we've been told about. And I haven't dug into that side of it, but I thought Paul Thacker just brought up a really fascinating point that this is the arm of the government that used to do that kind of work. And it was, at one time under Fauci.
When COVID hit, obviously people were scrambling, trying to find possible solutions. Um, one of them was ivermectin. The other one was hydroxychloroquine. These were readily available, cheap, easy to manufacture drugs. And could you explain why there was some controversy, large controversy around, let's say, hydroxychloroquine and its implications to Big Pharma and the rollout of the vaxes?
The controversy was manufactured under the guise of, oh, Trump said it could be good medicine, so therefore it must be bad. But that was all orchestrated, and the negative emotions about Trump plucked by an organized propaganda campaign that did not want us looking at hydroxychloroquine as a possible prophylactic, preventive, or early treatment that could avoid serious COVID, which many people who were independent and testing it at the time said they saw great promise, not when it's used late in the game, which the government tried to skew its use at one point and said, well, you can only use it when people are in the hospital and very sick. Well, the scientists knew that's not when it works. It'll look like it doesn't work if you wait and use it on people that are dying, because it won't fix them. And then you'll have stuff that makes it look like it doesn't work at all. It needs to be given in the early hours or perhaps prophylactically. The reason this could not work in the eyes of the pharmaceutical industry was probably for several reasons. If there is a repurposed medicine that's effective for a novel virus like coronavirus, we have a policy or a rule in the federal government, you can't make a vaccine. Like, vaccines are inherently, like all medicines, carry some risk, and you can't push an experimental vaccine on the public if you have a medicine on the market that works. So the industry had to be sure there wasn't a medicine on the market that looked like it might work. And they made sure that any studies that were being conducted on hydroxychloroquine could not be finished, because the government so controversialized it that, like, one of the researchers who was conducting a study independently, no financial interest in it, said at some point when the government made it out to be so dangerous, which it wasn't, he saw great promise in his patients. He said he couldn't enroll enough people to finish the study because, they're looking at the government saying this stuff is killing people, it's giving people heart attacks. And so he said the sad truth is he could never finish the studies that would have provided some definitive answers. And then when you look at the government body, the advisors that were appointed to make recommendations on what kind of treatments should and shouldn't be used, and it shouldn't be hydroxychloroquine unless you're doing it in a hospital when people are very, very sick. I always have learned to follow the money. So I looked at this panel, and a great number of them had financial relationships with the maker of remdesivir, which was a novel, new, expensive medicine that they were trying to push on the public, as opposed to these generic medicines already on the market. So it looks like they have a conflict of interest. What are the odds that so many of them have recently, in the recent past, received payments from the medicine that's now benefiting from the decisions they're making? Isn't that a conflict of interest? And then I looked to see how many of them had connections I could find to hydroxychloroquine, a generic cheap medicine, and I couldn't find any as far as when I did the same kind of search. So it starts to look like, as in other cases in the past, that the advisors the government is using to make these recommendations are, frequently on the payroll of the industries who are going to benefit from their recommendations.
Mm-hmm. It's so frustrating. Literally, hair pulling. Reading the book is difficult. Before we get into some silver lining, for those that might be dealing with some adverse effects, you mentioned the clotting that's been happening in folks that embalmers have reported on, and the insurance companies are saying, wow, we're really continuing to see, after these vaccines have been rolled out for a couple of years now, we're continuing to see, especially in young, healthy adults, we're seeing injuries and even deaths, sadly. Could you explain a little bit what's going on there, and what relationship did it have or does it have with the vaccines, from what we know at this point?
This is really important because, by the government's own admission, something like 75% of people may be suffering from what they're calling long COVID, which actually can also be long vax. They're grouping it together and pretending there's no vaccine effect. And from what the independent researchers who have been right about things in the recent past are learning, and I've reported on this for Full Measure, the spike protein that's in COVID, which is a very strange spike protein probably created by man for some purpose, is harmful to you in the long run, potentially, not even if you didn't get sick from COVID. So most people have had COVID, and even if you never got a case that made you sick, if you have that spike protein in you, it's enduring in many people, if not most people. And the minute your immune system has a challenge, or if you get older, or if for some other reason it triggers something, you may have and suffer something that you may not recognize, and your doctor likely won't recognize as related to the spike protein. You may have a retina detachment. You may have loss of hearing. You may have gut problems. You may have nerve damage. You may have shaking in one of your legs. You may have the heart damage and the blood clots that people talk about. But the tests that your doctors do normally won't show these things. They may tell you have multiple sclerosis. They may tell you it's all in your head. These are things that have happened to people. But also, the spike protein is made by the vaccine. So you can get it naturally through COVID. And then you can also, you're giving it to yourself. You're telling your body to make it when you get the vaccine. So either way, you're getting this. And the more times you're getting vaccinated and the more cases of COVID are probably amplifying your risks for the long-term damage that the spike protein can do. The good news is these independent doctors, government's not looking at this stuff in any serious way, but there are some independent doctors trying to do so. God bless them, with their own money and their own time, just seeing what's happening to their patients. There are ways to treat people like that. They just don't know where to go, and their doctors don't know where to send them, or probably aren't doing their reading on this topic. Dr. Jordan Vaughn, who's just a pioneer in this, said most doctors are still treating patients in the pre-COVID world with pre-COVID medical textbooks. He said it's all changed now. Your responses to certain challenges health-wise, your reactions to things that happen, it's all changed post-COVID when you've got that spike protein in your body. And there are ways to treat it. He has helped, along with others, some doctors like him who are sharing information around the world, have helped a lot of people, including other doctors, other surgeons. They've helped people who have been told by Mayo Clinic that there's nothing they can do for them, people who are bedbound, who are now out of bed, leading relatively normal lives. So these are the people that we need to try to encourage and lift up and figure out ways to help amplify their information, because if they're correct, we're all going to be suffering potentially some form of this in the long run over time from either COVID or the COVID vaccines. And they say not everybody they see is sick from the vaccine. Some have just had COVID, but the sickest people they see have had the most cases of COVID and the most vaccines, which they typically say are one and the same, meaning the more vaccines they've had, the more cases of COVID they've also had, and they tend to be the sickest patients they see.
Geez. I skipped over this question. I wanted to be sure to ask you. One of the components of this information war, as I consider it, was the changing of the term vaccination. Explain what happened with that when COVID came out.
This is really to me, from an information standpoint, one of the scariest things. I believe it was overnight, sometime between September 1st, 2021 and September 2nd, 2021, the definition of vaccine on the CDC website changed. And it went from saying that it was something that prevented disease, which is, what vaccines always did. It prevents you from getting the disease. Well, we knew by then, that the COVID vaccines weren't preventing people from getting the disease. But instead of admitting this isn't a vaccine that works, they changed the definition of vaccine and said, a vaccine is something that just creates an immune response. In other words, it may not prevent the disease, it may not prevent the transmission. So now the definition fit the vaccine that they had approved that wasn't working. And what I think is so stark about that is unilaterally, someone in the government redefined 200 years of our understanding what a vaccine is without so much as a public vote, public comment, a hearing, nothing. Some bureaucrat did this on their own by themselves, and I'm sure with input from the vaccine makers. And now that's the definition on the CDC website, and many people just accept it like it, the old definition is down the memory hole.
That is truly genuinely scary, especially when you consider that the the vaccine itself, the technology behind it, so dramatically changed with the mRNA type vaccine versus what at least I understood prior to that was more of an organic viral component that you're giving yourself the disease. You're giving yourself a tiny bit of the disease to create the immune
Well,
defense,
all,
right?
all I know is early on, one of my best sources who worked in the government, who worked on the mRNA vaccines way before they were out, told me in the beginning, yeah, the vaccines aren't going to work very well or last very long. Stuck in my head when he said that.
Hmm.
He's pro-vaccine to the extent that they work, and he said if they worked better, we'd have a vaccine for AIDS. That's an RNA virus. He said we've tried for over 50 years. We can't make one that works. So my expectations for the vaccines were lowered from the start. Speaking to this authority who knew early on that boosters would be needed, that kids, he said, didn't need the vaccines, and healthy people, but could be of help to some people at high risk, but they wouldn't last very long or work very well. And he was right. And I remember thinking later when people were so shocked that we needed a booster after 3 months, what shocking. I'm thinking, well, if you're a scientist, you shouldn't be shocked because scientists knew that. At least scientists in the know knew that on the front end. I knew it on the front end based on that. And people acted shocked. They didn't want the public to know up front. I think they wanted to grab if they had told people up front, tried to sell people on a vaccine, and they had said, think about this, before their first shot, you're going to need 2 shots now, and then a shot every 3 months, and it still might not work. Probably won't prevent transmission. It probably won't prevent the disease. Maybe you won't get as sick, but we're not sure. And you'll need these the rest of your life. I don't think many people would have taken it, but I think they knew that from the start, but they lulled us into it. Take these vaccines, you'll be protected, and then acted kind of shocked. Oh, yeah, you need another one now. And then pretty soon people were hooked. And you and I probably both know people that went, and every time they said you needed another one, instead of them thinking, I guess this doesn't work, they started thinking, yeah, I need the next one. And they've gotten every single one that's been recommended.
Mm-hmm. And who, if anyone to date, has been held accountable for anything?
Yeah, nobody. I mean, again, talk about scary things. Why would it be any different? Why would the repeat be any different when nobody's been held accountable for the disinformation and intentional misinformation the government was responsible for, and the miscounting of COVID, and the potential lives lost by, possible therapies being kept from the public? And I mean, to this day, doctors are still being persecuted who prescribed, treated their patients as they saw fit with therapies that were approved, safe and effective, and available to be used off-label per the doctor's discretion. And they're having their licenses pulled from them still, even today. I think someone told me Dr. Pierre Corey, who was a pioneer in mainstream medicine, esteemed and well-published, broke away when they started to try to keep him from treating his patients the way they should be treated, or the way he thought. I just heard today that they pulled his license a couple of weeks ago. This is stunning, but this is part of the medical establishment. This is pressure being applied by the medical societies and the licensing committees that are taken over by pharmaceutical interests to spank down these doctors that are coloring outside of the line so that more of them don't do it. How can you practice without a license? That's a pretty daunting threat obviously for a physician.
Yeah, for sure. As we're winding down on time, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that you give some ways for people to think more critically, as difficult as that may be, given all the stuff that we've briefly discussed in this conversation. Can you give an example or two of how somebody might be able to discern between fact and fiction?
Well, sad to say, but when you're getting a narrative kind of across the board from all the mainstream media, and they're all using similar verbiage, and they're all doing what I call the fake fact checks on the same topics and coming up with the same conclusions, your first question, your thought shouldn't be, oh, what they're saying must be true because everybody's saying it. It should be the opposite. You should be saying to yourself, this kind of a campaign doesn't happen organically. Everybody, all the news media doesn't just think of the same thing at the same time. So somebody has organized this. Who wants me to think this and why? In other words, what is it they don't want me to believe or find out about? And I would say more often than not, it doesn't mean the opposite is necessarily true, but I would say more often than not, the thing that they're trying to debunk has element of truth to it. So you should, as a critical thinker, say to yourself, powerful forces seem to think it's very important for me not to think this. I better think about that. And then there are ways to start looking at, I've given some ideas in the book, but sources who've proven correct in the recent past on certain controversies, I would consult those as they have developed web pages and made themselves available as a resource for future things. I would say, okay, this guy was right during COVID, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford. That's who I would probably give a good listen to on this other topic because he has a good track record. Those are some simple things you can do if you find out where to find the people who were right about things when everybody else was saying that they were wrong. Those are people you can consult and perhaps do some reading about what they're referring to and learn about their websites and resources so that you can consult them on medical information.
Would you be willing to share Maddie's story? Do we have enough time to touch on that? Because to me, that really provides a personal context to all of this.
Maddie was 12 years old when her parents allowed her to be enrolled in a Pfizer clinical trial in Cincinnati, Ohio. She's probably the first child injured by COVID vaccine because she was in the original Pfizer trial. She got very sick after her second shot, fell apart, it pretty much couldn't walk, rushed to the hospital, couldn't swallow, can't breathe over time, just worse and worse, electric shock running up and down her spine, crawling around on the floor because her legs don't work, can't hold her head up, seizures, the worst kind of life-changing problems that this child had. And her parents were shocked. They thought if their kid was in a clinical trial, they would get the best of care if something happened, and the opposite happened. Pfizer and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, according to the parents, washed their hands of Maddie. Instead of treating her like a red flag, this is like why you do studies. When you have a small study and a serious adverse event, clearly temporally connected to a shot like it was, that's your red flag. That's what you're looking for in a study. Instead, they carved her out. They said, I don't know why, without evidence, it had nothing to do with the vaccine. She just suddenly went from super healthy child to debilitatingly ill. And basically have ignored her since then. They don't pay for her health. They didn't get her help. She's still, as far as I know, bedbound. She's trying to get better. Her parents have, emptied out their life savings, trying to pay for her treatments and her care, which is full time. So I wanted to see what doctors, when I saw on left-leaning Medscape, which is a pharmaceutical supported site, and they're giving continuing medical education classes to doctors about COVID vaccine safety in children. I'm like, wonder what they're saying about Maddie. So I looked at this course being taught by 3 people who introduce themselves by their academic and professional titles and don't disclose that each one of them works for or gets paid by vaccine makers, as many as I think 8 of them, but they didn't disclose that in their oral introductions. And they show these slides and they quote the study that the doctor did that Maddie was in Cincinnati Children's Hospital and tell doctors there were really no serious adverse events to speak of. So again, doctors are being taught and not questioning and not understanding their information is conflicted, that Maddie doesn't exist. So instead of studies being done and then they listen to the data when it happens or the adverse event, they're carving them out, explaining it away, ignoring them and teaching doctors something that I think is not true. That's just a terrible case, what happened to Maddie.
It's tragic. Hearts go out to Maddie and her family. That must be horrible, horrible, horrible. The world has just been completely turned upside down. You somehow have been able to stay upright. What do you attribute that to?
I guess I've come to the conclusion that I'm a writer at heart. I love to write. And when I feel frustrated or I get information that incenses me, when I write it, I feel better. Doesn't mean the problem's been solved, but I feel like I've created a resource that, thanks to the internet, even if it's suppressed, that people can find and say, oh, I'm not alone, or there's that information I was looking for, or this is referring to a study I couldn't find. With the book, I feel that way about it. I've written down a lot of things that make me feel as though this is a reference for people, sort of a touchstone where they can understand, yeah, my feelings are rational, my questions make sense. Here's why it works the way it does. And here's some positive things that I can do. First of all, information is knowledge. It's going to help them understand they're not alone. that the questions they ask are reasonable and they should be asking them. But then there are tools where they can feel like they're taking some action. Because collectively, when we're all asking the questions and we're not silenced, it's much harder to ignore us. If you were to go to your doctor armed with some information, the doctor, and this has happened to me, may poo-poo you a lot of the time. But if we hold their feet to the fire and we find doctors and expect them to be more open-minded and read research or material that we bring them, they will start responding to that. Some of them will. So we can take some control of our own health. I've never heard so many people demand that the food be changed, that our adulterated food be changed. Maybe I'm paying more attention to it now, but I've suddenly in the past 2 to 3 years heard recognition of our and I've grown in my recognition of our adulterated food supply in a way that I never had before. California and some other states are now proposing rules to take out the artificial dyes that can be causing, ADD, autism is on that same scale, by the way, cancer and so on. Actions are being taken when people have information and knowledge. And I think that's a positive thing that can come of the book. I urge people, buy it and read it and then give it to your library or give it to a friend. Make sure other people see the information too. I hope I presented it in a non-threatening, nonpartisan way where people won't get too caught up in their political viewpoints, because I don't see it as that kind of thing. I think both parties are conflicted. I think there are, Americans on every side of the political spectrum are worried about these issues. So I hope this is information people can receive the way that I'm putting it out in the book.
I think that's the glimmer of hope in a lot of this. I think Brett Weinstein was one of the first people that I heard say this, that the silver lining is that they overplayed their hand, and that has woken up a lot of people. And we're finding that that's cross-partisan, cross-gender, cross-nationality. Like, we're in this together. And even if this is just a pure profit play, it's wrong. It's just flat out wrong. People are suffering, people are dying, and this is an opportunity for us to stand together. And your book might be the very catalyst that we're all needing to point to and say, see, this and this and this, to get some real change. So on that note, I want to thank you so much, Sharyl, for who you are, for standing upright amongst the storm and facing the headwinds that you face on a daily basis. And I hope I don't embarrass you by saying this, but because I touch on it quite a bit on my other episodes, you've done it in a remarkably feminine and graceful yet powerful way. I'm so impressed by who you are as a person, as a journalist, to be able to speak the truth without pulling your hair. For those that can see, your hair looks beautiful. You haven't pulled any of it off. And you've maintained that femininity, which I talk a lot about relationships on my podcast, and that's so commendable in my opinion. So thank you so much.
I want to tell people you are just a world-class guy. Peter has become a friend of mine since I was on your podcast some years ago. That's how we met, and we've stayed in touch, and you've helped me with things. And you're just a clear mind and a good critical thinker. And I so enjoy having you as a friend, and I appreciate you having me on your podcast again too.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. Again, the book is called Follow the Science. You can, of course, get more information on Sharyl's website at SharylAttkisson.com. Very quickly, as we were talking about people that had adverse effects and everything, what were some of the sources for them to potentially go to get help?
You can look at a protocol that's published by the FLCCC, Frontline Critical Care Doctors, with Dr. Pierre Corey and another doctor as co-founder of that broke away from mainstream medicine but developed these helpful protocols. You can show your doctor. You can buy some of these treatments yourself. Some of them are sort of naturally available. Dr. Jordan Vaughn in Birmingham, Alabama, with MedHelp Clinics, sees patients telemedicine. He's pretty overwhelmed, but he's seen some very famous people. He's teaching other doctors around the world with what he's discovering in treating long COVID and long vax. So those are two places to start. But yeah, you can start finding these references. There's a list of doctors at the FLCCC site who are either students of what they're learning or open-minded types of doctors. There's a directory where you can find a doctor in your area as well to consult if you don't want to do a telemedicine with one of the doctors practicing this kind of medicine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sharyl. Thanks again for this incredible, remarkable, eye-opening conversation.
Thanks.